Howdy, y'all. Welcome to part two of our videos on fallacies. So we're going to be briefly talking about fallacies with unacceptable premises here. And we just have 5 to talk about, so it won't take as long as our previous video. So the tricky thing about this section, though, is that what is unacceptable in terms of what makes the premise unacceptable differs from sort of fallacy to fallacy here. And so there's really sort of 3 categories of unacceptability. So one category is that you have a premise. This is, in my opinion, the most obvious, right? Is you have a premise that's false. So having a false premise is a bad idea. And so the fallacies that would fall under this category are false dilemma, which includes decision point fallacy. Decision point fallacy is just a subtype of the false dilemma. There's slippery and slippery slope. So false dilemma and slippery slope are the 2 fallacies here that have false premises, right? That's the unacceptability. There are 2 inductions, so inductive arguments that are sort of have bad versions. So these are sort of weak inductions that we need to kind of think about, and so the 2 examples of weak inductions or bad inductions are hasty generalization and faulty analogy. So in this case, the problem isn't that the premises are false, but rather that the premises are sort of insufficient to draw the conclusion that the induction is supposed to draw, right? So inductive arguments are supposed to support the conclusion. These are premises that fail to do so. Okay, the final sort of category here, and it's hard to kind of put a name on it, is whatever category sort of begging the question falls under. So the best way that I can describe the problem with begging the question is that it's not playing the game correctly. That a begging the question sort of argument is essentially just sort of arguing in a circle, and that's not what we want from an argument. We don't want an argument that goes in a circle. We want an argument that provides evidence for a conclusion. So we'll talk about all these briefly in turn, but so we'll start with the false premises stuff. So a false dilemma is our first fallacy with where essentially the problem is that you have a false conclusion, or excuse me, a false premise. And to talk about false dilemma, I want to talk about disjunctive syllogism. So disjunctive syllogism is a pattern that we discussed in chapter 3, which was valid, right? So anything that kind of follows this pattern is such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So the pattern, which I have up here, one version of it, is starts with the premise, right? Either P or Q, but not P, therefore Q. So this is this argument by elimination kind of reasoning, which is valid, right? If the premises are both true, that conclusion has to be true. So the only way for this argument to fail is to have one or more of the premises turn out to be false. And with false dilemma, the issue is that your either or sentence is false. So how is it possible for a disjunction to be false? Well, a disjunction can be false when it turns out that both the P and the Q, both of what we call the disjuncts, are false. So this can happen when there's some third or fourth or fifth option that could turn out to be true, right? So the idea here is you're presenting to the reader as though there are only sort of 2 options, when in fact there are actually sort of more than 2 options, right? There could be other things, and it could be that thing that turns out to be true. And if that's the case, then both P and Q are false, and the either or is false. So here's an example of a false dilemma, right? If you're thinking about somebody and their political affiliation, you say, oh, well, they're either a Republican or they're a Democrat, right? You can only sort of imagine 2 possibilities. when in fact those aren't the only two possibilities, right? You could have this person could be independent, right? They could be neither a Republican nor a Democrat nor anything, right? They're just not identified with the political party, or they could be one of a different political party, right? They could be in the Libertarian Party, they could be in the Green Party, they could be in the Natural Law Party, they could be in the Communist Party, they could be in the Socialist Party USA, right? All kinds of little parties out there that somebody could be a member of, and thus, you know, presenting the choice as either Republican or Democrat is a false dilemma. Here's another pretty common false dilemma, saying that somebody's either part of the solution or part of the problem. Rhetorically, that may be interesting to some people, but it's just false, right? It's not the case that you're either part of the solution or part of the problem. At least with most things, right? Maybe there's something out there where those are your only two options. Uh, and then here's another example that either we close the borders to everyone or let everyone in. Again, this is a situation where those aren't the only two options, right? You could be somewhere in between the closing the borders to everyone option and letting everyone in option, right? There's more than one possibility here. So again, false dilemma is just that. It's just a situation where the choice being offered is false. That there are other options besides just the two that are being presented with us. Here's another example of an argument with false premise, which is slippery slope. So a slippery slope argument is kind of fun because it works like a long chain argument where things sort of slowly get sort of worse and worse and worse. And I'll give you an example of that in just a second here. But essentially, it is like a chain argument. It's like that if P then Q kind of thing. So if P then Q, and if Q then R, and if R then S, and if S then T, and if T then U, and blah 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 blah, such that you get sort of a long enough chain, such that you start with if the first thing, then the last thing. But if your argument is, you know, getting sort of slowly worse and worse and worse, then what you usually sort of end up with is if this first seemingly sort of innocuous thing, then this really sort of bad, terrible thing. And which again, if it really is a chain argument, if it really is a chain of hypotheticals, like the hypothetical syllogism, then the conclusion would be true if all those premises were true. The problem is, though, that slippery slope arguments usually have one or more false premises. That almost every one of them is what we call sort of called the fallacy, the slippery slope fallacy. And the reason why that it usually ends up being false is that just being able to imagine a terrifying chain of events is not the same as being sort of justified and believing that this chain of events is going to sort of come to pass. So just because you can kind of link a bunch of things together doesn't mean that they necessarily have to be if you set that chain into motion. So here's my favorite example. It's not a one that we make a lot anymore because we've already sort of legalized gay marriage. But in the run-up to sort of the debate or into the legalization of the gay marriage, people were making this argument that I think was kind of fun because it's just so obviously goes wrong in a number of different places. But here's the argument. So it's a chain argument, and it's against gay marriage. So it says that if we legalize gay marriage, then we'll have to legalize polygamy. If we legalize polygamy, we'll have to legalize marriage to animals. If we legalize marriage to animals, we'll have to legalize marriage to inanimate objects. And if we legalize marriage to inanimate objects, humans won't make babies. And if humans don't make babies, then humanity will die out. Therefore, if we legalize gay marriage, then humanity will die out. It just follows from all of those premises. So if every single one of those premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, right? That's validity. But the problem with this argument is, I think in many places, just sort of obviously false. That we have legalized gay marriage, and we're not moving to legalize polygamy. But even if we did, I don't see why we would have to move to marriage to animals. Animals can't consent; they can't say "I do." So it seems like a natural stopping point. And again, I mean, even if we make it to inanimate objects and legalize it, I don't see how that would mean that humans wouldn't make babies anymore. Most people, when presented with the option to get married to an inanimate object, are not going to take that option. Most people are going to, if they get married at all, they're going to get married to another human. And many of those humans will procreate such that humans will probably continue to persist, even if any, for a short time at least. Therefore, it just doesn't kind of because those premises are false. The argument, which may be sort of valid, is not sound. But all slippery slope arguments are like that, where they start off kind of innocuous and they get sort of worse and worse and worse, and they become sort of fallacies when it becomes obvious that this is just sort of an imagined chain of events instead of anything sort of based in reality. Okay, so let's move on to sort of the other kind of unacceptable premises, which are the bad inductions. So there's two kinds of inductive arguments we're going to discuss here. One are generalizations, and the other are analogies. So generalizations, as I've mentioned, can be strong, right? So these arguments, there are good generalizations out there, but the premise of the argument needs to sort of adequately support the conclusion. And what a generalization does is essentially generalizes from a sample. So you take sort of a sample of things and you look at sort of the properties of that sample and infer to the broader population that the broader population has those properties as well. So hasty generalizations don't adequately support their conclusion because their sample size is too small. So a hasty generalization is when you try to generalize with too little information. So here's an example. So suppose I have a dog and I look at my neighbor's dog and both of our dogs can do tricks. And I try to generalize from that sort of data that, oh, that must be the case that all dogs can do tricks. Well, that's a hasty generalization. That is a situation where you just don't have enough data. You just have these two dogs and you're trying to sort of generalize over, I don't know, millions of dogs, and you can't do that. It's not enough data. It's insufficient to support your conclusion. Now, it can be done right, but hasty generalizations are sometimes referred to as anecdotal evidence. So anecdotal evidence is just another a way to sort of point to a hasty generalization, that you just have this story, just have this one sort of piece of data, and you're trying to generalize from that, and that doesn't work. So in Chapter 8, we will discuss what it makes or what it takes to be a strong generalization, and it can be done. But one of the things that you need to have for it to be a strong generalization is a large enough sample size. That the sample size plays a role in whether or not your generalization is going to be strong. And if your sample size is too small, it's going to be weak. Okay, the other induction that we're going to talk about are analogies, and again, analogies can be good. So in Chapter 8, we'll again, discuss what a strong analogy will look like. But essentially, what happens with any analogy, weak or strong, is you compare two things, and from that comparison, you try to draw conclusions about one of those things. So typically there's a feature that we're discussing that we know that one of the things has and not sure about the other thing, and so we assume that the other thing does have it based on the similarities between the two things. So when I get to my example, this will make a little bit more sense. But whether or not this argument is going to be strong depends on the similarities being compared. And if the similarities aren't relevant to the conclusion being drawn, then we say that the argument is weak. And it's interesting that the word sort of relevant sort of comes up here because, we just got done talking about sort of fallacies with irrelevant premises. It could be sort of argued that this is also a type of fallacy with irrelevant premises, that if your similarities aren't relevant to the conclusion, then even if they're true, you're not going to be able to conclude the thing that you want to draw. So here's my example. So my car and my bike, I'm going to compare those two things. They're both conveyances. They both have wheels that turn. They both have bikes for seats for sitting. And I know further that my car needs gas to run. So given how similar they are, I might want to conclude that my bike needs gas as well, right? I might try to draw that conclusion. But that's not really going to work, because having wheels and having seats and being a conveyance isn't really relevant to the question of whether or not something needs gas to work. There are other things that would sort of come into play that would be much more relevant, like having an engine and so on and so forth. So it just doesn't work as stated, but again, analogies can be strong, and we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 8. But for now, given that we've only talked about the bad versions, just sort of bear in mind is if you see somebody arguing in an exam or a quiz, if you see an argument by analogy, or if you see a generalization, it's going to be sort of an example of the bad kind. We'll get to the good kind later. All right, so this brings us to the last of the fallacies. This is the begging the question fallacy, or not playing the game. But begging the question is a version of what we call circular reasoning. And it's a fallacy because you assume the truth of your conclusion as a premise. So it's essentially arguing like this, P therefore P. That today is sorry, I lost my train of thought. Today is Monday. Well, why do you believe that today is Monday? Well, because today is Monday. That is, I guess, technically valid, right? And maybe sound, right? I mean, it would be a true premise if you were saying that on Monday. But it's problematic because you're not doing what an argument is supposed to do. An argument is unacceptable because we want, or this kind of argument is unacceptable because we want evidence for the conclusion. And we're pretty convinced that something can't be its own evidence, at least in most cases. We're not talking about things that are self-evident, right? We're talking about things that require evidence, and so we need something different. And so when somebody argues in a circle, they're not playing the game. They're not really sort of doing what an argument is supposed to do. So P, therefore P is pretty obvious, but begging the question arguments can sometimes be tricky to spot. Sometimes they're tricky to spot because you say the same thing in sort of slightly different ways, but essentially you're saying P, therefore P. So here's an example. The drug is effective in treating symptoms because of its ability to reduce the intensity of symptoms. So here we're essentially just sort of saying the same thing twice, but in a slightly paraphrased way or rephrased way that may not be sort of obvious upon first glance, right? You might just sort of think that somebody's making a good point here, where in reality they're just saying something twice. So it can be sometimes tricky, but sometimes it's pretty obvious. So here's a pretty obvious circle here. Somebody comes up to you and says that you should believe that God exists because the Bible says so, and then goes on to justify what the Bible says because it was inspired by God. You've gone in a pretty obvious circle there, right? Maybe there's two steps, but it's still the case that you've assumed God's existence in order to prove God's existence, and that's just not going to work. Okay, well, that's it for the fallacies with unacceptable premises. So now that you have both videos that have covered all of the fallacies, we're not really going to get into the rhetorical devices stuff, so you don't have to worry sort of as much about that. And you should be sort of good to go with exercise 5.2 and 5.3, and then also the stuff that will appear eventually on the exam.